Hello again, everybody. Continuing from where we left off, we talked last time about the suicide rates among whites, but especially white men. Why are suicide rates so much higher in whites, but especially white men, than looking at Hispanics and African Americans? Again, in sociology, we're looking at the behavior of groups of people. We're not focusing on individuals. This is more along lines of psychology. In sociology, we want to look at groups of people. We want to find patterns among those groups. We are looking for patterns and what happens between groups, okay? So here, the group that we're talking about is white men and their high suicide rates. As was said earlier, there is no biological characteristic or trait that explains the behavior of a group of people. That's true for some individuals. There can be biological traits that affect the behavior of individuals, but not groups of people, okay? So the question remains is, why do white men commit suicide at such higher rates as compared to the other people in the study? And if we look at this map here of the United States, we can get our answer. So again, practicing our sociological imagination, looking at these margins, we can see that the margins of this issue are those states that are dark blue. They are dark blue because they have above average suicide rates. That's one side of our margin. The other margin is the states that are green. These are the below average suicide rates. So we're looking at the margins, we're looking at the extremes. Those states with the highest suicide rate, those states with the lowest suicide rate. What do the states with the highest suicide rate have in common with one another? What do the states with the lowest suicide rate have in common with one another? Well, when you look at the dark blue states, you might notice that these are some of our most rural states. These have low populations, and they also have low population density. The people that do live there live farther apart from one another than in the states that are green. In the states that are green, these are the states with our largest cities. We have Los Angeles and the other cities in California. We have Chicago here in Illinois. We got New York. We got Boston. We got New Jersey. We've got big cities in these green states, which means higher population density. There's more people living in smaller spaces. So what Durkheim found was that the people who are at the highest risk of committing suicide are the people who felt more socially isolated and had lower social integration, less connections to other people. So when you're living in a state that's green, chances are you are living in a city. There's more people around you. There's more opportunity to make social connections with others. When you're living in one of the states that are blue, chances are you live farther away from people. There's less opportunity to make those social connections and higher probability for social isolation. So it isn't the states that are blue have these higher suicide rates because the people there are more isolated. And this relates back to the first graphic that we looked at with whites and white men. It's because they are the people that make up the majority of the population of these blue states. There's nothing about whiteness that causes suicide. It's social isolation that causes suicide. So if these blue states were populated by black people, it would be them with the high suicide rates. If these states were populated by Asians, it would be them with the high suicide rates. It happens that these states are mostly populated by whites, so it's whites with the highest suicide rates. Again, there's nothing wrong with whiteness, right? We have to look past that and see what are the forces of society that are contributing to this social condition that we are looking at and examining, all right? So that answers the suicide question. Going further, there's a number of different ways that we can do sociology. There's positivist sociology, interpretive sociology, and critical sociology. Positivist sociology is based on empirical evidence. It's based on numbers and statistics and this kind of data. Empirical evidence is the kind that you can observe with your senses. You can see it, you can touch it, you can taste it, you can feel it. In positivist sociology, we work a lot with numbers and statistics. You've probably seen positivist sociology. If you've ever seen something that says 59% of Americans feel this way about this thing, that's positivist sociology being displayed to you. Okay? Now, when we do and use those types of statistics, the three that are most commonly used are the mean, the median, and the mode. Now, we aren't going to calculate any of these things in class. There is no math to do in our class. But we will be looking at information where this math has already been done. So it's important to know what the mean, median, and modes are. Hopefully you remember this from math class. The mean is the average, right? You add up all the numbers and you divide them by the number of numbers you added together. The median is the center value. If you arrange all the numbers in order, the one right in the middle, that's the median. And the mode is the number that occurs most often. Okay, the mean, median, and mode. And in different times, there'll be different validity to each one of these numbers being used. Anytime we collect data, it's really, really important that the data that we collect is both reliable and valid. Reliable data is data that is repeatable. It is consistent. It doesn't change. And valid data is the data that we mean to get and want to get. So if I wanted to do a very, very simple study that was, what is the average age of the students in the class? And in order to do that, I asked you to email me your birth date. And then I used all that information to calculate the average age for the students in the class. And then let's say tomorrow there was a substitute and they did the same thing. Well, if nobody had a birthday, they would get the same answer. And let's say somebody else does it next week. If nobody had a birthday, they would get the same answer. That data is reliable. It is consistent. No matter who does it or how often you do it, you're going to get the same answer. Reliable data. Valid data, again, is the data that you mean to get. That's the data that you want to get, and you're not accidentally getting something else. You might be familiar with a test called the IQ test. And the IQ test is meant to measure a person's built-in intelligence. Not how much you've studied or how many books you read, but just how naturally smart you are. So if there's a test that claims to do that, it's really important that it's reliable and it's valid. So if I go in on Friday and I take the test and it gives me a score of 120, if I go on Monday and take the test again, I should get the same score, right? My intelligence, my built-in intelligence hasn't changed. I am who I am. If I take it next month or next year, it should be the same thing. That would be reliable data. I get 120 every time. Never actually taken it. I don't know what my IQ score is, but you get the point. Valid data means that if this test is saying it's going to measure my built-in intelligence, well then that better be what it's measuring and not accidentally measuring something else. There's a number of questions that get pulled out of the IQ test regularly. It's always being audited and updated and changed. And there's lots of questions that get eliminated if they fail one of these two criteria, if they're not reliable or if they're not valid. One of the questions that I've chosen to remember about the IQ test that got booted off because it wasn't valid was a picture that showed a man dressed in a suit walking out of the front door of a home. And the question was, where is this man going? It's pretty vague, right? Well, the correct answer was, this man is going to work. Now, that could very definitely be a correct answer, and for maybe a lot of people that is obvious. But can you think of a person or group of people who might look at that question and think, well, I'm not sure what that answer is, but I know for sure it's not he's going to work. Remember, this test is based on your innate intelligence, which is going to rely a lot on your experiences growing up. So if you grew up and the man in your life, whether that was your dad or grandpa or uncle or someone else, went to work wearing a suit, that might be an easy question for you to answer. If you grew up and in your house, the man in your life went to work wearing a uniform or wearing coveralls, then you might think, well, I'm not sure where that person's going, but I know it's not work. because dad or grandpa or Uncle Tom, Uncle Bob, they get dirty at work. So they're not going to put on a suit to go to work. They might wear a suit to go to a wedding. They might wear a suit to go to a funeral. They might wear a suit to go somewhere else, but never to church, but never, ever, ever to work. It so happens that if the man in your life went to work, wearing a suit, he was working a white-collar job. And if he didn't go to work wearing a suit, chances are he was working a blue-collar job. So really, this question wasn't asking about a person's intelligence. What it really was doing was asking about a person's social class. If your family was middle class and higher, you were more likely to get this question correct because dad had that kind of job. If your family was working class or lower, you were more likely to get this question wrong because the men in your life, they didn't have jobs like that. It wasn't really measuring your intelligence, it was measuring something else. So remember, it's really, really important that the data that's collected in sociological research is both reliable and valid. We're going to use this data because what we're ultimately trying to find is a cause and effect relationship between two things. Why is it that this thing is and exists in the way that it does? What is causing this? Earlier in the previous video, we talked about people who are in poverty. What is causing their poverty? Why are they in those conditions that they are in? What is the cause of that? Those people who are wealthy, what is causing their wealth? What are the conditions in society that create it so that they can have this enormous amount of wealth when there are so many people who do not? These are the things that we're looking for. And in order to best answer those questions, we need to make sure that the data that we're getting is reliable and valid so we can look at and find this cause-effect relationship. This is all related to positivist sociology. Another kind of sociology is interpretive sociology. Interpretive sociology doesn't deal so much with raw numbers, raw statistics, things that you can add together and subtract from one another. That's positivist sociology. Interpretive sociology focuses more on the meanings that people attach to the things around them and that people attach to the world. For instance, an example of an interpretive sociological question might be, which group of people experienced more historic cultural damage? Was it Native Americans through westward expansion and the genocide that was committed against them? Or was it Africans and African Americans due to the transatlantic slave trade? This kind of question you can't really answer in the same kind of way. You can't say, well, African Americans are 29% more culturally damaged than Native Americans. How do you quantify that? How do you get those raw answers? Well, you don't. And this is why it's more of an interpretive sociological study. We're looking at the meanings that people attach to these things. Okay? Critical sociology is the last of the three that we're going to talk about. And critical sociology isn't especially unique from the first two. Critical sociology simply focuses on doing something and calling an action for change. So when we talked about the suicide rates among white men, right? We learned who it is that commits suicide the most, white men, and why they commit suicide the most, lack of social integration and increased social isolation. Okay? Now we know. That's good to understand and know. Critical sociology is when we say, what can we do about that? How can we correct that? We don't want people committing suicide. We don't want people dying. We don't want people feeling like they have no other escape other than to kill themselves. So how can we try to fix this? That's what critical sociology is. It focuses on doing something. Okay, so again, it's not specifically unique from those first two. It's about taking action. All right? So these are the different types of ways that we can do sociology: positivist, interpretive, and critical, and some of the characteristics of each.